Children are dismissed to go to the Children's Church. I appreciate everyone filling in for Susan today. Tammy's done a great job. I appreciate you doing this, Tammy. And of course, Dinah and Ann. She, of course, had surgery back on Friday and doing well, but hurting a little too much to show up today. I think you want her here or grunt and groan. So, but hopefully she'll be back to work by the end of the week. And I appreciate all your prayers. We got a lot of text messages and people saying they were praying for her, concerned about her, and that meant a lot to us. You know, why are we here? Well, we're not a club for socializing, though we do socialize. We're not a group that just gets together out of habit. We're here for a purpose. And that purpose is found in our mission vision. And I just want to read it and talk about it for a moment as a reminder on our ultimate purpose here. We are here to reach our world for Jesus. Jesus is the key. We're not here to do religion. We're here for Jesus. And then once we reach those people, we connect them to our church and then help them grow into mature, wise, and fully devoted followers of Jesus Christ. Notice we're not just looking for church members. We're looking for people that are Christ followers, that are going to live for Jesus and serve Jesus. It goes on to say, who serve and glorify God. That's why we're here today. We're here not to watch a show. We're here to glorify God. But it doesn't stop here in the worship service. We glorify God in everything we do that's according to His will. We glorify God every time we serve in His name. We glorify Him every time we love others. And so we need to understand that once we leave here, our worship continues. We may not be singing songs to the Lord, though sometimes we do. If you ever see me going down the road singing, I'm probably singing a praise song. And just be glad that the windows are rolled up and you can't hear it, because I can't sing worth 2 cents. But we also glorify God in our actions, how we live, how we touch the lives of others. So as you think about being a part of this church, whether you're an official member or you're associated, you consider this your church, remember, that's why we're here. And if these are not your purposes, your priorities, you need to reevaluate prayerfully how you need to change your life, your priorities, so we can live this mission.
What I see back there is the block party little post-it notes. I'm getting really excited about that, but we need lots of help whenever we're getting ready for the block party. So get one of those little post-it notes and come help us out, because it's going to be really exciting. I've never had a block party before. It's going to be good. I'm glad that Susan is doing better and got that yucky gallbladder out there. We're just going to pray for her and ask that God just make sure that that's all she needs to be better, that there's nothing else. Okay, if you would all stand, please, we'll sing some more. Praise the Lord.
At the cross.
straight here. Okay.
As we begin this new series called God's Light in Life's Dark Night, we've all had times when we found ourselves spiritually in the dark. One great saint called it the dark night of the soul. Those times when we're very low spiritually and we can't seem to find God in our life during those critical times. Now, I would love to tell you that the Christian life is always those mountaintop experiences of joy and celebration and expectancy and miracles happening everywhere. And that does happen. But there are also times when, for all kinds of reasons, we find ourselves in a dark valley of despair, struggling, wondering why God is allowing us to go through this, wondering whether God is causing this. And so, the next few weeks, I want to share with you some various biblical characters experiencing exactly that thing, because you're not alone. When we experience those times, we need to realize that all of the great biblical characters in the Bible experience those times as well. We're going to be looking at some of those. And today we're going to look at the life of Jacob. I want to start out by sharing a little bit about what happened to Jacob before the event we talk about today. First of all, how many of you had sibling rivalry with brothers and sisters? Okay? You know, where you'd fight, fuss, and feud. I had two cousins. They were 1 year apart, and the oldest cousin out of these two was 1 year younger than me. It seemed like every holiday they'd get into it. I mean, we're talking getting into it. We're talking, you know, flat out beating the tar out of each other. Usually the older one would needle the younger one, and the younger one finally lose his temper and go at it. And I'd be scared sometimes that someone's going to have to go to the hospital the way things were going. But what's interesting is, in spite of that sibling rivalry, when they got to be older, they were still very close. It's the old, I can pick on my brother, but you would not pick on him. Well, we have two brothers in the Bible that struggle with sibling rivalry. Their names was Esau and Jacob, the sons of Isaac and Rebekah. If you rewind your mind into Genesis chapter 32, that's where we're going to be picking it up. But let me give you a little background first. Isaac had been wanting children and had prayed for God to give him children. And finally, Rebekah, who had been barren, finally had children, and they were twins. And God had told Isaac that these twins were going to have a rivalry, and the younger would be served by the older, which was the opposite of the way it usually worked. Well, Esau was born first. They named him Esau because that is the Greek word for hairy. Okay, imagine the hairiest guy you ever saw in your life, half gorilla. Well, that was Esau. But right after Esau, Jacob was born, holding on to the foot of Esau. And it was almost like Jacob was saying, hold it, I want to be first. And he was named Jacob, which means grappling at the heel. But it also means deceiver. Imagine having the name deceiver or lying deceiver. Imagine your father introducing you and Esau. Here's my one son Harry, and the other one deceiver. But that was Jacob's name. Now, Esau was a man's man. He liked to hunt. He liked to fish. He probably, if he was looking today, would be driving a Ford F-150 pickup truck. And he had season tickets to Ultimate Fighting Championships and professional wrestling. He was that kind of guy. If there were magazines back then, he'd be reading Outdoors magazine. Jacob was different. He was the opposite. He was a mama's boy. He hung out at the tents. Rather than hunt and fish, he liked to cook and hang out with the ladies. He'd be reading, housekeeping and cooking magazines. He'd be watching the cooking channel rather than the outdoors channel on cable. Very, very different. But Esau was not sharp like Jacob was in manipulating, charming, and deceiving people. That was Jacob's strength. Matter of fact, if Jacob were alive today, he'd be selling cars someplace, making a whole lot of money and ripping off a whole lot of people. He'd been the perfect used car salesman. Well, to make the long story a little shorter, the birthright, which was the authority and the power of the firstborn to get most of the inheritance and to run the family, was given to Jacob because Jacob had fed Esau, and Esau was very, very hungry with red porridge. And Jacob said, I want something from you, buddy. I see the wheeler dealer in action, right? You don't want to play cards with this guy. I want your birthright. And Esau was so hungry and so dumb that he gave up the power, the authority, and the blessing of the birthright. Later on, Jacob wanted to have Isaac's blessing, which was a special measure of favor and authority given to usually the firstborn son. So he dressed up like Esau. He put on a furry garment so Isaac in his old age with bad eyes could feel the hair and think it was Esau. And he faked being Esau and was given the blessing by Jacob that was supposed to go to Esau. Well, Esau found out. Do you think Esau was happy about it? You think he said, no big deal? No. And Jacob had to run for his life. And for the next almost 30 years, he hid back up in the northern part of Mesopotamia, hundreds of miles away from where he'd grown up. He went back to his mother's father. And there he met and married two wonderful women, okay? And their names were, anybody remember? Oh man, you guys are flunking here. Rachel and Leah, there we go. But what's interesting is the deceiver got deceived. The scammer got scammed. His father-in-law cheated him out of the first choice, which was Rachel, and had him marry Leah, and then he had to work 7 more years to get Rachel. Okay, now can you imagine being married to two sisters? You know how all that probably went, right? So there was all kinds of rivalry during that time. But after over 20 years passed, it was time for Jacob to go back home. God had told him it's time. He had to go back and face Esau after cheating Esau out of the birthright and the blessing. He had to go back and face his brother. Now, that was almost 600 miles away. That was a long 600 miles. More than just the distance, it was the wondering what was going to happen. And as the story goes, as he got close to where Esau was, he sent his family ahead with a gift, thinking that if my family and this gift gets there before me, maybe he'll be easy on my family and just kill me later on. He didn't know what was going to happen. And so this is where we pick up the passage where it says that he stayed back. And then in verse 24 of chapter 32, so Jacob was left alone that night. And a man wrestled him till daybreak. A wrestling match happened. And we're talking real wrestling, not this fake professional wrestling you see on TV. This was the real deal, and it went on all night. This is an interesting little story that's a little confusing. And so what I want to share with you is how we can relate to this. And we've been where Jacob was that night, where we've lived our life the way we've wanted for a long time, and it looks like finally we're going to get paid back for all the things we did. Consequences are awaiting. And so Jacob that night is struggling with this man from God. Who was it? We don't know. Was it an angel? Probably. Some people say it was possibly Jesus Christ in a pre-incarnate form. That's a possibility as well. What we do know is this man was from God. And Jacob wrestled him all night. You see, we need to realize that during dark times in our lives, when we're finding personal crisis, we often will feel trapped, hopeless, and alone like Jacob felt that day. And then, during that dark time, like Jacob, for his homecoming, he was anticipating what might happen, all of it negative, with Esau. We ourselves find ourselves in a personal crisis where we have to face up with decisions we have made that now we're facing the consequences. And during these times, it will seem like God's far away, but suddenly he'll show up. And he will do some personal business with you. That's what happened that night. There was a spiritual struggle going on. For Jacob was wrestling a man from God. For you, it may not be a literal man from God that you struggle with. But that struggle, we need to understand, is with God, but really we're struggling with ourselves. The consequences of what we've done. Payback time has come, like it has for Jacob. And this struggle with God was a decision time for Jacob to decide who he was going to live for and how he was going to live in the future. We need to understand that there's Jacob in all of us. We may not be liars or deceivers like Jacob was. We may not be connivers or scammers, but instead, what we are people of various sins that control our lives. Maybe it's materialism. Maybe it's the quest and the gaining of power. Maybe it's some other thing where God has been replaced by our own desires. I call that the self-life. Living for ourselves, the self-life. Paul in the New Testament called it the flesh. Whatever you want to call it, we're not living for God. We're doing things our way. Now, we may be good people in many ways. I don't know if Jacob was so much that way, but we might be good people in many ways. But the bottom line is we're living for ourselves, doing things our own way, rather than God's way. And when that happens, we got a Jacob problem in our own life as well. Now, understand also that every spiritual struggle we have is not necessarily because of self-life. A lot of it is. A lot of times we go, God, why is this happening to me? Why am I struggling in my life? And God wants to say, look at yourself, because you're the reason. Because it tells us in Ephesians 6:12, for our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. In other words, sometimes it's not about us, it's about Satan attacking us. And so you've got to determine whether this struggle you're experiencing is because of the Jacob in your life or a satanic attack in your life instead. Satan will always attack when you're trying to live, and being halfway successful, you're living for God. But understand, don't blame Satan when it's your problem, the Jacob in your life. But don't focus on the Jacob in your life if it's really Satan attacking. It requires prayerful evaluation in our life to see what's going on. You see, Jacob's problem was Jacob, not Esau. Up till that night, he saw Esau as the issue. But that night, he had to wrestle with himself. And the angel was simply the means where Jacob had to decide who he was going to live for. Was he going to live for God, or was he going to live for Jacob? Up till then, he lived for Jacob for the most part. He had a relationship with God. God had come to him multiple times. But still, he was living for Jacob. And we need to realize that the struggle can bring decision and brokenness in our life. It tells us in Genesis 32:25 these words, where the man saw that he could not overcome or overpower Jacob, so he touched the socket of Jacob's hip. So his hip was wrenched as he wrestled with the man. This struggle went on all night. Now, don't misunderstand this passage. When it says that the man from God could not overpower Jacob, it's not that the man could not wipe Jacob immediately off the face of the earth. He had the power of God. It was not that Jacob was more powerful than God. That's not the point here. The point is Jacob wouldn't let go of the man of God that represented God himself. You see, for the first time, Jacob had to make a decision. Was he going to hold on to God rather than hold on to Jacob? Was he going to live for God rather than live for Jacob? This wrestling match was not just against that man, it was against himself. Now, some argue this wrestling match was simply a spiritual struggle within. Others argue it was a physical struggle that actually happened. Whichever way it is, and I tend to think it's a physical struggle that actually happened. The point was Jacob was the focus, not the man from God. And that struggle sometimes, though it went on one night here, can go on for a period of time in your own life. It's decision time with God when you find yourself in this kind of struggle. It may go on a few hours, it may go on a few days, it may go on a few months. But we got to decide, are we going to hold on to God? Is that more important than holding on to ourselves? Are you willing to let go of your Jacob and hold on to God? Or are you really willing to let go of God because the struggle is too much? The man could not overpower Jacob's desire to hold on to God. That's what's happening here. It wasn't that the man of God was not powerful enough. It's that the man of God could not overpower Jacob's desire to, for the first time in his life, hold on to God as if his life depended on it. Jacob was willing to die that night rather than let go of God. Isn't that amazing? Now here's the problem. Too often when these decision times come, these God moments, we decide that it's easier to let go of God and live for ourselves. Often what happens during these dark times in our life is we don't see God around us. We don't see God answering our prayers. We feel alone, so we walk away. Right now, there are places where people could be sitting, that are sitting here, that have come here in the past, but some spiritual struggle happened. And because the struggle was too much, and they were too angry at God, they walked away. They let go of God. The struggle was too much. Jacob, for the first time in his life, realized God was more important than Jacob was. Amen. And understand that often when this kind of thing happens, we will be broken spiritually. Now, in Jacob's case, he was broken spiritually, but he was also broken physically. For it says this man of God touched his hip, and immediately his hip was out of joint and was never saved again. He had to walk with a limp. And sometimes in our own life, when we struggle with God, we'll be broken, and there will be signs of that brokenness with us the rest of our life. We will walk with some kind of spiritual limp. But that spiritual limp is not a sign of sin and weakness. It's a sign of victory because we finally dealt with our issues. We've let that Jacob go in our life, and now we're walking with God, and we'll be different because of it. And that difference will be evident to other people. As Jacob walked around after that, they could see the physical limp. They probably asked questions, what happened? He goes, let me tell you what happened. I wrestled with the man of God, and he did it. What a powerful testimony that Jacob must have had at that point. And during that time of brokenness in our own life, our whole life may fall apart. Areas like family, career, finances, health, other personal give up everything else to hold on to God during those dark times in our life. Remember, we're often there in those dark times because of our own sin, self-life issues, our Jacobness. Will we let it go and hold on to God? So much that we want God more than we want to even live. That's the question that Jacob had to decide. And during that decision time, some will choose to let go of God. Others will continue to live the self-life, experiencing life's consequences without God's blessing, without God's protection, without God's fellowship. Which will you choose in your own life? Some of you right now may be wrestling with God in various ways. I myself have been down that road multiple times during what I call that dark night of the soul, where I was struggling, where God didn't seem to be evident. By the way, God has always been around. We see sometimes we miss and forget what he's done. It tells us, as a matter of fact, in the first part of Genesis chapter 32, if you go back and look, that while he was traveling to meet Esau, 2 angels came to him. Now, we don't know what happened in this meeting, but according to what happened, it affected Jacob greatly. You see, too often when we're in that struggle, we forget the times he has been with us. During the times of struggle, we need to remember the times when God has touched us in a personal way, where miracles happen, where there's no doubt God has been there and been in our lives. Don't forget those times, folks. Now, the man asked Jacob what his name was. What is your name? Now, you think the man of God didn't know? Of course he knew what Jacob's name was. What he was asking Jacob was to admit who he really was. What is your name, Jacob? Deceiver, liar, conniver, scammer, double dealer. Jacob finally had to face up to himself on who he was. It goes on to say in verse 28, then the man said, your name will no longer be Jacob. And this is what God offers each one of us today. As Christians, we're born again, a new life. And every day we can be born again anew as we let go of the old, the sins, the mistakes, the baggage of the past, and we look forward to what God wants us to do. The man of God said, your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you've struggled with God and with men and have overcome. Now, let me explain what he means by Israel. It doesn't say that he struggled against God. He struggled with God, and we all struggle with God. As we grow spiritually, as we experience new challenges in our life, there's always struggles. The struggle's a part of growing, right? Have you ever seen a baby bird born? And, you've seen it on TV, if not in real life. They struggle as they break out of that egg to become alive again. And we're constantly struggling with God against ourselves, the Jacobness in our lives. And what's being said here is you will found a great people. Your name is now Israel. You'll have a people of God that will struggle with God to be the people they need to be. And folks, we need to understand that if you're comfortable, if life is easy, your spiritual life is easy, there's no struggle, there's something wrong. Either you become the perfect Christian with sinlessness. Anybody reached that point yet? Last I looked, the last person was Jesus. Okay? Or if you find yourself not struggling, it means you got some issues. Spiritual life is struggle. It's not easy street. It's not unicorns and rainbows and little castles in the sky. It's a time of victory, but also challenge and struggle. The spiritual war continues on as Satan attacks us and our own self attacks us. That Jacob within us wants to gain control. But as Israel that day did, we don't let go, we don't give up. We want to be blessed by God more than we want to live the life of Jacob. Today you need to do what Jacob had to do. And that is that you need to admit who you really are. You know, it tells us in Jeremiah 17:9 that the heart is deceitful above all things. Who can understand it? Let me tell you a little bit of background story of that verse. Where it says the heart is deceitful, you know what the word for deceitful is? In Hebrew, Yaakov, Jacob. When Jeremiah said that, your heart is a Jacob. Deceitful above all things. We fool ourselves, folks. We fool ourselves in thinking we're better than we are. We fool ourselves thinking we don't have pride problems when we really do. We fool ourselves in thinking that we're wonderful people and we do some good things, but the evil is overpowering and overshadowing the good we do. Are you willing and ready to stand up and speak out about yourself to God and say, I am a Jacob, but I want to be an Israel. I want to struggle with you and prevail, not against you, God, but against the Jacob in my own life. I want a new fresh start, and that can happen today. And by the way, the fresh starts happen over and over again. Why? Because no matter how spiritual we get, there's that times we get away from God, and we have to come back again. But remember, when you think of Jeremiah 17:9, where it says the heart is deceitful, remember, the heart is a Yaakov, a Jacob. Wow, can you imagine being a guy where your name becomes synonymous with deceitfulness? That's what happened with him. And realize this, a part of God's new blessing and new stars, it gives us a new identity. Just as Jacob that day got a new identity as Israel, we do too. But with the identity comes a new purpose. No longer was Jacob living for himself that day. He began living for God, and he was the beginning of a great nation that today is still there. The nation of Israel. A nation that no one will ever defeat as long as they walk with God. Because they are Israel. They have struggled with God. And they need to prevail. We need to realize also that our own identity, our own purpose will be a little different from each other. We all look a little different, in case you haven't noticed. Okay? Some people are not as good looking as me. True? Thank God a lot of people are better looking than me, right? I was called to do what I do. You've been called for a different purpose. To serve God is the same ultimate purpose, but a different ministry. Are you living that way? Or are you living for yourself? Who's in control? Jacob or the Lord? If you're not struggling today, and you're not living for God, maybe it's time you start struggling with God. Have that wrestling match with the Lord. And be willing to hold on to the Lord more than anything else in your life. And to admit who you really are as a person. That hurts, folks. I don't like being broken. It's not fun. But it's necessary to be remade into who God wants you to become. Or you can continue to live as a Jacob. Or are you ready to start living as an Israel? The choice is yours. In a moment, we're going to have an invitation. A time for response. This is a time not only for someone who may have never made a decision to become a Christian, to make that decision today. We want you to do that. And how do you do that? Well, you simply say, Lord, I'm ready to give my life to you. I believe that you are the Son of God, is Jesus. And you're my Savior, my Lord. You died on the cross. I be forgiven of sins. That's what it means. If you've never made that decision before, will you make that today? That's the first step in getting rid of the Jacob in your life. And you can come forward and share that with me. We can talk further and answer your questions. Or you can simply mark it on that Connect card. Hand it to me or put it in the offering plate, and I'll get with you and talk with you further. But if you've never made that decision, don't leave today. God's calling you to make it. But for the rest of us, it's decision time. Are you struggling with God? Are you ready to let go of the Jacob in your life? Are you ready to become that new identity, that Israel, that whatever it is for you? For those that aren't struggling, because you're just not living for God at all, it's time to get into the struggle and prevail against the Jacob in your life. Let's all stand as God speaks to us today.